Radio Free In, episode 235, the final episode of the Gargoyle saga. That's right, we are finally ready to finish the fight.
But first,
you might remember at the end of the very first Gargoyle episode, their guitarist Shija left the band. See, she remembered. And you might remember at the beginning of the second Gargoyle episode, I said we were going to cover what Shija got up to after leaving Gargoyle later. So you remember that too? Well, guess what? We're going to cover that right now. Because it actually is fairly connected to Gargoyle. Because Shija started up this new band called Volcano, and it actually had Katsuji from Gargoyle playing drums on the first two albums. But then he ended up leaving in 2003 after he got in an argument with Shija after he showed up drunk at a Gargoyle concert.
Really? I just spilled the entire fucking drink combination I had!
Yeah, probably something like that. So Volcano pretty quickly went from being some sort of weird side project of an ex-Gargoyle member with a current-day Gargoyle member to becoming just the main artistic output of an ex-Gargoyle member. However, musically, it will definitely hold a lot of interest for most Gargoyle enthusiasts, and most importantly, it features on vocals this guy named Nove from the band Ion. Ion's a whole other can of worms, probably a band I'm gonna have to cover at some point, add them to the list with Terra Rosa and Anthem. But all you really need to know now is Nove is one of the few vocalists out there that can match Kiba from Gargoyle for like a really weird interpretation of how a thrash metal vocalist should act. As soon as you put a Volcano album on, most metalheads are probably gonna think, hey, this sounds a lot like At the Gates or something. The reason for that is a rather interesting case of convergent evolution. Very similar to how X-Japan sort of accidentally ended up sounding a lot like Halloween by taking melodic speed metal and then combining it with very fast punk drumming. In this case, Volcano took these sort of like melodic speed metal style of guitar playing and then shortened the musical phrases for the sake of impact. And then to that, they added a lot of like death metal aesthetics, and they kind of accidentally invented their own version of Slaughter the Soul with a whole lot of sets of riffs. As I intimated earlier, Nove's vocals, he sounds like a crazy person, perhaps a little bit more inclined towards a sort of power metal consonance than Kiba, but still more similar to Kiba than pretty much any other vocalist. One of the things that defines Shija's tenure in Gargoyle as a guitarist was his tendency towards these very epic, narratively driven solo sections, and that's definitely a thing he continued with in Volcano. He actually reminds me a lot of Andre Olbrich from Blind Guardian, with how his solos are almost more just like new sets of riffs played higher up on the guitar neck, and they interlock very nicely with all of the rhythm guitar thrashiness going on under it. So that's Volcano, a sort of unique hybrid of power metal, thrash metal, and the thrashier end of melodic death metal with a crazy person on vocals. You can see why I say if you're into Gargoyle, you'll probably like Volcano. But speaking of adding more of a death metal component, after Yotaro left Gargoyle and they scaled back to just one guitarist, that being Kentaro Yokota, Gargoyle got a whole lot heavier. You could kind of see this coming based on the development between Gaia and Future Drug, but latter-day Gargoyle is definitely the heaviest they've ever been. A lot of this can be put down to the louder, more modern-sounding production, but there's also way more of an incorporation of dissonance and very percussive music phrases. Especially as we move into the 2010s, they become a very abrasive sounding band. And yet they're a little bit too progressive and complex to be considered sort of your standard early 2000s groove metal band. Here's a really cool, very groove-oriented set of riffs that again almost remind me of like the second X-Hoarder album. Really nasty utilization of artificial harmonics, those pick squeals, combined with some borderline death metal backing vocals that then lead us into an interesting sort of reverse counterpoint to that thrash metal section from earlier. As far as modern thrash goes, I gotta say Gargoyle's up there near the top of the heap when it comes to intensity, but also songwriting complexity. For instance, this bit right here where they've completely deconstructed that riff from earlier into an ultra primitive percussive variant, which then opens the song back up into a lead guitar section. And even the lead guitars just sound way more foreboding and dark than they used to. It's still, flashy and Gargoyle-ish, but overall it's taken on a much darker cast to it. That's not to say they've completely abandoned the eclecticism of their earlier albums. They still do wacky funk stuff, although most tracks of that variety are concentrated towards the first half of this third era of Gargoyle. And even then, the weird funk experiments tend to be a bit heavier and way more thrash metal-y than we're used to hearing from them when it comes to these sorts of tracks. But the super technical bass playing is still there, and that's always what made these kind of tracks stand out to me. They tend more towards the incorporation of clean guitar as opposed to an outside instrument like a trumpet or a violin compared to the earlier days of these funkier Gargoyle tracks. Interestingly enough, however, they do utilize a lot of clean vocals left over from the Gaia era. Speaking of wacky funk tracks, you might remember on the first episode about Gargoyle, I talked about the song The Good of the People off of the Aratama album. It's one of my favorite Gargoyle songs of all time. But they did a really weird remake of it during this most recent era of Gargoyle, and it gives me an opportunity to talk about sort of a second band that they all started. The name of this band was Battle Gargoyle, and it's literally just Gargoyle, like it's everybody that's in Gargoyle. But when they do live shows, they only play the heavy tracks. There's not really that many of the goofy ones. And they also do this interesting thing where they remake a lot of their goofier tracks from way back in the day in their newer, heavier style, which is what they did with The Good of the People. And it's almost hard to recognize as being the same song unless you're really familiar with the original. I mean, if you were just to put this on without having heard the original, you'd be like, oh look, it's another fast, technically complex Gargoyle speed metal song. Like, the real old heads might recognize the lyrics, but musically it's very different. Like, this part wasn't in the original at all. I mean, I'm not complaining because it's a heavy fucking riff, but then you get to sections like this, and you start to go,
oh, there you are.
you know, you start to recognize what used to be those clean guitar licks being turned into thrash metal riffs. And then wait until you hear how they end up doing the old female vocal section I like so much. Did you recognize that it was that part, but like way heavier and more thrashy, and with the feminine element entirely removed, and the wacky jazzy solo being replaced by this nasty thuggish groove riff. Later, Gargoyle is interesting in that regard, being very cognizant of their history as a band and also being a re-examination of that history. They even started doing shows where you'd have a Battle Gargoyle show and it's like only men are allowed at that, and it's all the super aggressive songs, and then they'll do like a female only show and it's all their weirder, poppier songs. Given that I tend to prefer the latter, I don't really know what that says about me.
I might also just be gay, although who the hell knows in these increasingly strange days.
And speaking of wacky gimmicks, I don't know where the hell else I'm going to talk about this, so I might as well bring it up here. Apparently, up until 2017, Gargoyle owned a bar called G-Arc that was in Shinjuku, and it wasn't like they were just collecting money off an investment. They would work at the bar as hosts, and with what little I know about like the whole hosting culture, all I can guess is you're there drinking a beer and then members of Gargoyle just come out and like fuck with you.
Oh my goodness! What are you doing? I've never seen so many dead hookers in all my life!
Which sounds fucking awesome. But getting back to Battle Gargoyle, their original songs were also super duper heavy. They actually bear more than a passing resemblance to Volcano, which is pretty interesting. And their combination of like power metal, thrash metal, and melodic death metal. Actually, depending on your taste in metal, Battle Gargoyle might be one of the more effective entry points into the massive Gargoyle discography for a more conservative-minded metalhead. But Gargoyle proper, once you get closer to the current year, their guitar playing gets even more technical and bizarre than it was during their first two eras. Like, for real, I don't even know how you write riffs like this.
Everything's all loop-de-loops and flibberty-gibbet.
And yet they managed to maintain that sort of solid East Coast US style thrash metal gang shout core to everything, which is what keeps it all uniquely Gargoyle, even when they do wacky voivod riffs like this. With a cool little melodic bass line running under it, leading directly into some more of that X-Hoarder style groove thrash that they picked up somewhere along the way. I mean, if that isn't a bizarre coupling of different styles of thrash metal, I don't know what is. Building up to an absolutely massive chorus. The song is Go Go Galapagos? Yeah, I don't really know what that means. Gargoyle always had weird lyrics. Something about evolution and giant monsters and mutations and shit is the best I can figure. I also really like that cool drum roll thing that Katsuji's doing. That guy was always excellent. Most of my favorite songs of latter-day Gargoyle tend to fall into sort of a thrashy yet melodic kind of power metal style. The intro melody to this song, Face of Fate, the first song off of their 2013 album Kiju, stumbles into some very interesting territory by taking the spazziness you might hear in a song like Go Go Galapagos, slowing it down and playing it a little bit more cleanly. You end up with something that sounds like Vector almost. And everybody knows how much I like Vector, so obviously I like this shit a lot too. With a very suspenseful thrash metal build-up riff leading us into Gargoyle's highly unique take on almost kind of German-style speed power metal type stuff. Like a really weird dissection of an early Scanner riff or something. With a high-octane, double bass drum-led chorus. Super catchy, as it should be, but then without even stopping for breath, they transition back into that weird riff from earlier, but now Kiba's winding this weird vocal line around it with these like sea shanty backing vocals. That's not something you're going to hear outside of Gargoyle, and that's why I love Gargoyle so much. They're entirely unafraid to take chances, and yet their songs always feel super cohesive. And they always have high-quality melodic solos. If anything, I gotta say, out of all the genres of metal there are out there, solos are probably most important in thrash metal, just because that whole genre thrives on the dichotomy between the really percussive bludgeoning stuff and then the soaring melodic lead guitar lines. It's been like that since before thrash metal was even really codified, going all the way back to stuff like Diamond Head and Angel Witch, and Gargoyle seem to be keenly aware of that history. If I had to pick a favorite album from each era of Gargoyle, I would say for the first one, the Shija era, I'd probably go with Aratama, Uncut Gem. For the second era, the Yotaro era, I'd go with Tsuki no Toge, Splinters of the Moon. For the third era, I have to go with Kuromiten, or The Black Tome, the 2009 album. That super percussive song I played way back at the beginning of the episode, right after we listened to Volcano, comes off of that. But this album also has a whole bunch of cool sort of like weird melodic power thrash tracks in the vein of that Face of Fate song. Entitled Shi ni Itarukizu, a fatal flaw in Round Eye.
I think I'll use my credit card.
And it has one of the coolest, most Japanese sounding lead guitar lines I've ever heard.
Do you guys have anything non-dairy?
It's so sick, it sounds like something right off of one of my Psy albums.
Anything gluten-free?
But then those unmistakable vocals kick in over the speed metal riffs, and you know you are listening to a high-quality Gargoyle song. Honestly, this one and Face of Fate sound very, very similar, and they came out within a couple years of each other, but I love them both so much, figured I'd play you both of them.
We'll do it live! Fuck it!
You know, we'll call it a song form. Bach had minuets and gavottes, Beethoven had symphonies. Gargoyle's got that song, What Were They Do, the power metal and the thrash things with the shouty vocals. And they even do that thing where they bring back the opening riff, but with all sorts of new layers added. In Face of Fate, it was that crazy vocal line. In the case of Fatal Flaw, it's this jumpy, polyrhythmic chugging riff. See, that's how you know Gargoyle are a pretty darn unique sounding band, given that they have these song forms. It's not just like, oh, this is the fast song, this is the slow song. This is that Gargoyle power thrash style song. This is the Gargoyle style funk song. They're a very unique band with a very strong sense of identity, and I like them a whole lot, which is why I talked about it for 3 episodes. Nowadays, Gargoyle is kind of semi-dormant. Pretty much everybody except for Kiba has retired. However, if you remember the days of Battle Gargoyle where they had this parallel band going, Kiba is actually doing that right now with the bassist from Sex Machine Guns, which is a very interesting band from the 90s that was also heavily influenced by Gargoyle. Another band that's acknowledged Gargoyle as an influence is Duran Gray, of all people. But anyways, yeah, he's got that guy and a bunch of other younger people playing live with a new unit called Under Gargoyle. So maybe we'll get some new albums out of that. I don't know. But hopefully you liked all 3 of those episodes, or at least one of them, or at least you watched and listened to them. Thanks for doing that. I'll see you next time.
I'm bad.